Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Hey, welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Are Donald Trump's punitive and some would suggest arbitrary tariffs against, just about everybody illegal? That may be decided, and the whole world will be watching when the Supreme Court of the United States meets later on this week. Well, you can get into the essence of this here because it does have implications here for Canada and just about every other government, too. They're going to be meeting in the middle of this week here, and they're going to be hearing oral arguments from Donald Trump's side and others about this tariff issue. It's going to be deciding, essentially, not just whether or not tariffs are legal or illegal, but really, I guess, the essence of the debate that's going to be going on here is the limits of the president's power in the United States. And now this is something that we've talked about on the podcast many, many times, and something that it seems to be a pretty gray area, at least the way Trump and his people see it anyway. We know, and we've described, without getting too deeply into the constitutional element here, that there are three levels of government. We understand that. There's the administrative, the executive, which is the president. The administrative is the Congress and the Senate. And then, of course, the judicial. And they're supposed to be separate but equal. That's a key phrase in their constitution. And ours here in Canada, our system is, although it's the parliamentary system, basically has the same tenets, separate but equal powers, okay? Which means they all have opportunities and they all have responsibilities. So should the president have the ability to weigh tariffs? Well, according to some experts, no, he's not. I mean, that's not within the purview of the president to do that. But of course, he's been doing it all the time anyway, under the guise of a national emergency. So this is going to be very important. And it's important to us here in Canada because if the Trump policy about tariffs is ruled to be illegal, should they stop immediately? What about compensation? If they were deemed to be illegal, just talk about that implication for a second. Does that mean that we should get our money back? The tariffs that have been paid, the companies and anyone else who has paid tariffs should be compensated for that? This is a big deal. It's a big decision that has huge implications. And I got to tell you, I'm not confident that the Supreme Court in the United States is going to rule fairly on this or look at this objectively through the eyes of justice, as opposed to the political spectrum that they seem to be looking through with just about everything else. So let's just talk about what's going to be happening here. Of course, when they hear arguments, if anybody's ever watched the Supreme Court in either country, Canada or the United States, they will sit there in all their glory, of course, on their benches, and basically hear arguments from both sides here. Trump's people will have legal experts. Those that are challenging this will have legal experts. The justices will be able to question the intent and some of the back and forth about some of the presentations, like, what do you mean by this or what about that? And the lawyers themselves, of course, are going to be armed with precedent after precedent and stacked legal documents and books citing cases like that. Now, we're not going to get into the minutiae of that. That's up for them to do. But the essence of this right now comes down to, I guess, interpretation and some might suggest wordsmithing. The act that Trump has been using right now is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That's a mouthful, I know. And essentially, what this did is it gave, 1977 is, by the way, when the Congress passed this, it gave the president powers to regulate imports. Okay, now that could be any number of things. It could be setting quotas. It could be doing any number of things, but it doesn't use the word tariff in any way, shape, or form. The word's not even in there. So one side is arguing, see, it's not in there, so you can't do this. And the Trump administration is saying, yeah, okay, maybe it's not in the act itself, but it's implied. It's one of the tools. And they're saying, no, you're extending this. And this goes all the way back to what we've talked about, let's deal with the situation here in Canada, okay? Other countries and other jurisdictions have got their own concerns about this. But a lot of this had to do with Trump basically saying that, the United States was under threat, a national emergency. Now, I think, when the founders wrote this Constitution, and even when the Congress passed the act that we've just referred to, they're probably thinking about, well, wartime, missiles are being trained on us right now, or troops rather are under threat in different parts of the world. It takes bold action. I don't think they ever thought that it was simply going to be an arbitrary decision by an American president to simply say, I don't like you, so I'm going to impose tariffs. And for those who might still be Trump fans, and I know there are some there, uh, that's exactly what this is. It's such an arbitrary fashion. As we've talked about on the podcast, he initiated a 50% tariff on all goods from Brazil, basically because the Brazilian government challenged the former president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, for basically trying to corrupt the past election there, in which he lost. He's going to jail now. And he's a buddy of Trump's. I mean, these authoritarians like to stick together, right? So he's just saying, okay, Brazil, you're going to pay a price now because you're prosecuting and convicting a guy that I like. There's no economic reason. There's no national security issue here, but he's simply doing this. The same thing with Canada. Arbitrarily imposing these tariffs because, obviously, the billionaires that supported Trump to get him back in office basically want nothing to do with free trade. They don't like the deal that's been struck that Trump himself signed between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So they're making stuff up. Remember the fentanyl crisis, which, by the way, they are still referring to. That there's a huge, huge crisis, and it's a national security issue, all the fentanyl that's flowing from Canada in the United States. Well, we know that's a lie. Yes, there is a problem, but it's less than 1% of all the stuff that goes into the United States comes across the Canadian border. The problem really is, from the Canadian standpoint, is the stuff that's going across the border from the Americas into the Canadian economy. The fentanyl, the guns, the stuff that's going on there. But they don't talk about that. This is a made-up crisis to try to justify what Trump has been doing. However, bold that might be, and however incorrect that might be, the fact of the matter is so far he's getting away with it. Now, when you get into the court situation here, as I mentioned earlier, they will talk about precedents and, this is how you decided this, so that's the same mindset that should apply to what's going on here. And one of the precedents that's going to be brought up is the way the Supreme Court basically slammed the Biden administration on a couple of different occasions, saying they don't have the authority to do this. One had the forgiveness of student loans, remember a few years ago, which people applauded at the time, especially when we're talking about, the problems with the young generation right now. This mountain of debt that they're all assuming, and it's impossible to start their lives, to buy a home, get started in business, etc. So the Biden administration decided, okay, let's have a loan forgiveness program. Good idea? Well, no, because there was challenges to it. It went to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that the president cannot arbitrarily make those decisions, that has to be done with the cooperation and with the thumbs up from the Congress, from the Senate, and from the House, with a la Constitution. So they said no. Same thing with the vaccination programs that the Biden administration tried to put forth when it came to employees in the government. They said no, that has to come from Congress. That's not a presidential power. So is that a precedent? You might think so, but we don't know whether the court is going to actually adhere to that because they have already sided with Trump on just about every other issue. Anytime the Trump administration has questioned their authority to be able to do whatever they want, whenever they want, to whomever they want, the Supreme Court has sided with them. Essentially, just a few months ago, giving the Trump administration a blank check and saying, yeah, it's okay. Under the guise of national emergency, these presidential powers are okay. Sending troops into Portland, a number of different things that he's done over the last little while. The court has simply said, yeah, I know this is what the Constitution says, but we're going to cut some slack here and let them do this. So there's a hypocrisy that's going on here. Why is it going on? Well, it's a numbers game, isn't it? We know that right now, almost every decision by the Supreme Court down in the United States falls under a 6-3 vote, and because there are 6 hardcore MAGA people on the court who simply side with Trump no matter what the issue is, no matter what the Constitution says. It's not the way the system is supposed to work. They are supposed to be the independent arbiters in situations to be able to do an evaluation of the laws and the Constitution itself. I know that there are some elected officials that simply say, look, we got elected by the people, so what we say goes, and that's it. Nobody should question that authority. Well, that's wrong. I'm sorry, and I know we've got politicians on this side of the border that think that same way. It's wrong, because the judicial side of this are the ones who are. I used the analogy a little while ago. They're like the referees. I know it's not the perfect analogy, but it just gives you the idea here. They're the ones that say these are the guardrails that you guys have to operate under. These are the rules. This is the Constitution. These are the laws of the land. And we will interpret if a piece of legislation or a directive that you guys want to do, whether or not it fits within those guardrails. If it doesn't, they throw the flag on it and say, see, you can't do that. That happened with Stephen Harper's Get Tough on Crime legislation. Remember a few years ago, bit by bit, the Supreme Court had to rule on just about every aspect of that and said, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. It's against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court is supposed to exercise that same impartiality and simply look at this through the justice prism as opposed to the political prism. And we don't know exactly how they're going to do and how they're going to rule on this particular issue. And it's so important because of the implications. And if you simply say, well, the law is the law and the Constitution is the Constitution, and the Constitution pretty clearly states what powers Congress has, what powers the president has, and what powers the courts have in situations like this. But those lines have been blurred under the Trump administration, and one of the reasons why is because of the appointees that Trump has put on the court over the last number of years that basically adhere to whatever he wants them to say. And that's not a very comforting situation to think that something as important as this is going to be adjudicated by people like that. We saw a couple of the hearings, that Congress would go through with Trump's nominees to go onto the Supreme Court. And they lied, under questioning from senators. They lied about what their intent was when it came to, for instance, Roe versus Wade and issues like this, and simply turned around, no matter what they said, to get their approval from the Senate and get their appointment onto the Supreme Court, simply did whatever Trump wanted them to do. And I feel very, very sad about the fact that the system is being corrupted and played the way it has been, but that's the way things are right now. So am I confident that the court is going to rule objectively on this? No, I'm not. And that's unfortunate. But that doesn't mean you don't go through the process anyway. So that's going to be happening all week. And we in Canada are going to be watching this because we're very concerned about how this is going to have an impact on our economy. Not to put everything in isolation, because it's all part of a bigger picture, right? We've just gone through a budget process here. The government is trying to move forward on a number of initiatives to get the Canadian economy back on track after some rather shaky times, of course. And the tariff issue is a major issue. And if the court rules that, Trump can do whatever he wants, he's got the power, unlimited power, then we have got to be on guard to say that, look, as bad as things might be vis-a-vis our relationship with the United States on so many different levels, but from the economic issue, let's focus on that for a second, that it's only going to continue. It's only going to get worse before it gets better. And that sort of validation from the Supreme Court is exactly what the Trump administration is looking for. So we will be paying attention. I know we've got concerns on this side of the border. I know we're worried about the budget. We're worried about housing, all these issues that we've talked about, and the government will try to address those, I guess, going forward. But at the same time, we can't be oblivious to what's happening south of the border, because it does have an impact here. I know Poilievre tries to rant and rave, with obviously no foundation or basis in truth in it, that everything that's going on in the country right now, everything that's bad, of course, is Mark Carney's fault, which is BS. We all know that. He's basically excludes the impact that the United States government administration is having here vis-a-vis tariffs on our economy, on so many different elements of the Canadian dilemma and the Canadian challenges that we're facing right now. We need to be aware that what goes on there does have an impact on what's happening here in Canada. And we're not just talking about culturally or anything else. It's now seeped into a legal endeavor by the United States to try to corrupt the whole system. So basically establish an authoritarian government and a court system that's simply going to validate that. And it's sad to see that going the way it has in the United States. And it's very, very troubling to understand that it's going to have some serious implications here in this country. So I don't know when the decision is going to be rendered. They usually take some time after this. There'll be the hearings, there'll be these presentations, there'll be the back and forth, and the debate will go on. And invariably what the courts tend to do is, okay, we'll take this under advisement, and then sometime, probably, we hope anyway, by the end of this year, they will issue or render some sort of a judgment on this. And my guess is that it's probably going to be just as we talked about, down on the lines of the 6 mega conservative judges are going to rule in favor of Donald Trump. The others will not. But that will be the validation that Trump is looking for right now. Now, I know that there are other issues going on in the states right now that we've talked about here on the podcast. There are elections going on. These are not the midterm elections that so many people have been referencing. That doesn't happen until next year. But there is some concern about the impact this is going to have vis-a-vis Republicans, Democrats, and the balance of power. Now, on the other side of the coin, you could look at that and say, does it really matter? Because Trump doesn't end run around Congress and the Senate these days. He's got the majority in both sides. The MAGA folks control both those houses of government, but he doesn't even let them pass any meaningful pieces of legislation. He does that all through executive order. And again, the Supreme Court has said, yeah, that's okay. That's Donald Trump, so he's allowed to do that. These are troubling times in the states, and we can't ignore the fact that what happens there is that it's going to have a major impact. I think it was Pierre Trudeau said when he was prime minister, living next door to the United States is like when the United States sneezes, we catch a cold, because it impacts just about every aspect of our lives. So important issues. We'll be watching carefully, and of course watching to see how our government responds and reacts to what's going on with the Supreme Court decision. Just a quick note. Before we finish off on the podcast today, we just learned this morning as we were going on to start the podcast here that former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney has passed away. Cheney, of course, a major influence in U.S. politics for many, many years, starting with the Ford administration and, of course, for George Bush Sr. in that administration, and eventually became the vice president under George W. Bush. Now, there's an awful lot written about Cheney and the power that he exerted. There are those that suggest that, for instance, in the 8 years where George W. Bush was the U.S. president, it was actually Dick Cheney that was running everything. There's a characterization in many circles, of course, that George W. was not the brightest bulb on the string, and that Cheney took advantage of that. And Cheney, of course, was a very close friend of George Bush Sr., and there are those that suggested that Cheney got the vice president nod and the nomination from the Republican Party, basically so Bush Sr. could keep an eye on the Bush administration. He was his eyes and ears and exerted immense power within that administration. So much so that he was the voice and the power behind, for instance, the Iraq War, the weapons of mass destruction debate, and the invasion and eventual, of course, execution of Saddam Hussein. Some suggested that was for political reasons as opposed to the national security issues that they talked about. A lot of that is outlined. I just want to get a plug in here to Bob Woodward's book. This is called Plan of Attack. Now, this goes back 2004 is when this was actually published. But it's an in-depth and I think very, very critical analysis of what happened in the Bush administration. And it kind of underscores just how important Dick Cheney was and how he profited hugely financially from the war in Iraq. He and Donald Rumsfeld were the two folks that really seemed to be pulling the strings here in the Bush administration. And you remember that was, Colin Powell's address to the UN, the weapons of mass destruction, yada, yada, yada. Cheney, they say, was the author of all that. So it's a mixed legacy for a guy who was a huge influencer in the Republican Party. Which also reminds us, of course, that for all intents and purposes, the Republican Party is dead in the United States right now. It's the MAGA party. And we can also include in that legacy, I guess, of Dick Cheney, his constant bashing of Donald Trump. These guys really butted heads. Cheney, I think, resented the fact that Trump basically corrupted the Republican Party and the right-wing politics that was going on in the United States. And so did his daughter, of course, Liz Cheney. So it's an interesting dynamic, and there'll be a lot talked about over the next couple of days about Dick Cheney and his influence going forward. And I think also to Republicans, and I'm talking about traditional Republicans in the United States, the Bushes and the Cheneys and others, I guess it's a sad reminder of just what they were once and how that has changed under Donald Trump and how he has basically hijacked that party for his own benefit. Lots going on, and we're so happy to be able to bring you these stories and have a discussion about what's happening like this in the podcast. That's it for this edition of the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, great to have you with us. Please hit that notification bell so you can pass the word on. And thank you to everybody who's subscribing. I am so happy to see so many folks coming on board. I'm glad you enjoy the podcast, you enjoy the dialogue that we're trying to put forth here and bring the discussion back to the impact it's going to have on you and me as individuals. And, of course, on a larger level of what's going to happen nationally and globally with some of these issues. There's a lot of power struggling going on these days. And don't think as if you're just going to be an observer that has nothing to say and nothing to do. The best information you can get is what you need to form an opinion. And then, of course, we need to exert what political power we have as individuals. And we'll try to encourage that here on the podcast. And your subscriptions, by the way, give us that opportunity to carry on with that work. So thank you so much. And we appreciate the subscriptions that we already have, and, of course, the ones going forward, too. Please consider that. Thank you to Madeline Kelly for the great work producing the show today. Busy times, and we're going to be back talking about the Canadian budget and lots more in the days and weeks ahead on our podcast. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed. Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.